We are very pleased to welcome Melissa Clark-Reynolds to talk about solutions to carbon reduction and neutrality being employed by cities and regions globally. Melissa is a Foresight practitioner and professional director who serves on the boards of Weta Workshop, Daffodil Enterprises, Atkins Ranch and Alpine Energy. She's a tech entrepreneur and a former CEO of technology companies, and she now teaches courses on strategy, digital governance and disruptive business models. What better person to give us a bit of post-prandial inspiration? So welcome, Melissa.
Ahi Maria mai tātou mahina kia koutou, ki te rongorawa rā ko papatūna ki tēnara. Ki ngā mana whenua o tēnei rohe, mihi kia koutou. There's so many, it feels kind of a cop-out, but when you have 5 mana whenua, I just assume that I'm mihi to all of you. I feel quite privileged to be here and daunted by how fast I'm going to run through this. So a little bit more about my background. I have this thing called an MCRAP, which my family finds hilarious, which is a Masters of City and Regional Planning. I did do it many decades ago. As I was doing it, I specialised in environmental health, and I did half of it at the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, which is in New Jersey. I started down this track, and in 1989 I studied climate medicine at medical school, and I ended up, so half of my degree is actually in environmental epidemiology, which until about 3 years ago people would show me their skin rash and I'd go, that's dermatology. Now everyone Googles it, and it's ridiculously depressing to have a master's degree in something that, it's like, yeah, good old Google, thank you. But in 2016, I had the pleasure of going to Stanford University in a program that was called the Te Hono program, which is a program that's designed for the New Zealand primary sector. And I spend most of my life these days working in food and agriculture or in agri-tech. And I think a lot about the future of food and the future of agriculture. And I'm going to take you a little bit through some of that today. And in 2016, while I was at Stanford, we spent half a day with a futurist, and I was like, oh my God, that brings together so much of what I've done in my life between the sort of environmental work. I also have an honours in anthropology and this sort of deep background in tech. And particularly what happened is that early on in my career, I was literally the only person in my master's program who knew how to code. And so what would happen is that we'd be trying to work out how pollution flows were going to go in a river, and it turns out that modelling fluid dynamics in a river is actually almost the same as modelling how a pandemic might play out. And so that was really why I ended up taking this sort of slight detour into technology for quite a long time. But I trained as a futurist in 2016, and then I've continued to train ever since with multiple world-renowned futurists, including like the world's leading Islamic futurist. I've been in the UK last year doing a really fantastic program on building community futures. And I do quite a lot of work in the background with councils and with agencies, including public and private, on creating futures with communities, so on marae, in union offices, with farmers, whatever it is. And so as a futurist, I have 2 of these things I'm really interested in and we're going to look at today. So the top one is megatrends, and these are like the global forces that are around us that really, you're just spitting in the wind if you think you're going to do anything to change much about the impact they're going to have on our lives at this point. So they're big global forces, and I'm really curious about those. And then down the bottom, I'm really curious about weak signals. And weak signals, what we think of there is, I almost think about them being like little messages from the future that are in the present. And they're not like my hunch about a trend or something. They're not like what colour you're going to wear next year or whether we're going to like be doing more home decorating. What they're really about is looking at very specific products or specific things that have occurred in the world around us. It might be the launch of a product or it might be the launch of a new report, but there's specific things. And so I really play in those 2 kind of the big world picture, what's happening around us, And there's very specific kind of micro things. And what we know about the future is that it tends to go what we call gradually, and then suddenly. And if you're only paying, if you're not paying attention, the suddenly feels like, holy hell, what was that, you know? But I have to say, I worked for the Ministry for the Environment in 1990, and I wrote a report saying that in 2022, Nelson would both be underwater and be hit by a pandemic. And I was wrong about which pandemic. I thought it was going to be dengue fever. But what was really interesting about that is that all of the information that was available to us in 1990 was that this would be the decade. And when I was at med school, what we were encouraged to call this decade was pandemic century, and that it would be the kick-off. And so, interestingly, I've been back in touch with a bunch of my professors in the last few years, as I've done a lot of work globally around whether it was M. bovis, or whether it's been this, or whether, you know, COVID, or whether it's been the Japanese encephalitis, or, you know, I'm watching a whole bunch of avian flu. And what I would say is that these things, they emerge over a long time. They can feel really sudden and random if you're not looking, but if you're looking, they've been coming at us for quite a long time. So some of the things that I'm kind of thinking about at the moment in terms of what I'm thinking as megatrends that are affecting New Zealand is this idea that, you know, there is this push towards more of a weightless economy. And, you know, fascinating to sit both on the board of a meat company and of Weta Workshop, where, you know, on one hand, what we're really selling is very high-end kind of know-how, and I'm going to actually say that's the meat company. And then on the other hand, we're actually shipping product, which is Weta Workshop. You know, we shipped out 600 costumes for Gladiator the other day when I was in. And so what we think about is what is weightless and what is not really changes over time, but we see this move towards a weightless economy. This one I'm calling, like, there's algae in the water cooler, is people are not coming back to work. Globally, what we see is that there's roughly a 40% attendance rate at work. And interestingly, the stats from New Zealand show that New Zealanders are coming in 3.5 days a week, which is one of the highest percentages anywhere in the world. And that's kind of typical of us. We're a slightly more sociable culture than many others. Interesting again that the research shows that those conversations around the water cooler, I don't know if anyone wants to guess what they're about, but it turns out they're about sex and pets, not together. But they're never about, I know, but they're never about those serendipitous moments that you think you're going to have a work breakthrough. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. So there's a bunch of these big changes that are coming around the world. The one I've called the new digital divide for me is now the people who work with AI and the people who don't. And I know we already have another digital divide in New Zealand, which is the people who have access to the internet or have access to mobile, and I certainly know there are parts of our region that don't still, and there are people in our region who don't have devices at home, but that divide is about to double down as we think about the people who are working with AI and those who don't. But I want you to take away this idea that there isn't one present, that your present and my present may not be the same. The family I grew up in was what we called a high dependency family. I was the first one of my generation to go to university. I was the first one to be employed. You know, there's a bunch of that. My aunts, I don't remember them ever being off a benefit. And so when we think about that, their world and my world is not the same world at all. And so it's very easy for us to think that there's one future out there, and I want you to stop and think the current present is messy and contradictory, and the future will be too. And one of the biggest skills we need as we go into these messy and contradictory futures is to be able to see multiple futures and not just hope that there is one future out there. So I mention this because in 1913, what's really interesting here is this is the year that cars took off in New York City. So Easter of this year was the year that cars completely nailed it. Now, prior to this, there were a small number of personal vehicles, but interestingly, EVs were at a greater production rate than the internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine won because the infrastructure that enabled people to have internal combustion engines won. So the infrastructure for EV charging just wasn't that great in 1900, but the ability to put in a petrol station was a whole lot easier. And prior to that, what you'd had to do is, this is the first car that drove down Fifth Avenue in New York, and people like mocked this guy unrelentingly. And I've gone back and I've read the microfiches, and they were just like, what a moron. You know, you have to take your horse and cart down to the docks to pick up the fuel. Like, why wouldn't you just get hay? Like, this is stupid. Do you get this? And I think it's important because often when we're faced with change, we forget that actually as a species, we've been going through these big changes for quite a long time. And mostly what I would say, and I've spent my whole career in technology, I've got like the ONZM for services to technology, but I just want to say that the technology is never disruptive. What is disruptive is that the regulatory environment changes and the economic environment changes. And once the economics change, it doesn't really matter what you think the tech is like, because it changes. And I think we're in one of those tipping points at the moment where the economics is changing so fast that in some ways, you know, those of you who turn up now and try to make changes in the transport system, oh my God, you're going to look amazing. And you look really amazing almost regardless of what you do at this point, because the economic changes are so inexorable that you kind of, the effort is very different. And I think this is worth thinking about, that there are tipping point moments where things have been going slowly, suddenly. And for them, this was slowly, and then, you know, back, like 5 years later, there wasn't a horse to be found. And we forget sometimes that we've been through these moments of great change before. The EV technology was better. The good technology almost never wins. The one with the best business model wins, and the business model for the internal combustion engine is currently going into a great period of failure. So I want you to kind of be aware of these greater socio-economic issues. So around the Wellington region, you know, we're seeing this impact. It doesn't really matter whether you believe that we've got an impact from climate change or not. We are certainly experiencing things that seem to imply that the research that people have done for 50 years and told us that this is going to happen seems to be coming true. And so what we can also see if we start to play with more and more of that data is the storm surge data, which is the data I'm particularly interested in. You heard in my intro, I sit on a lines company board down in Timaru. We have got more coal in use for process heat for the food industry than anywhere else in New Zealand. And so despite being a resident here, you know, in Whanganui-Atara, I'm on that board because we have to, you know, we really have to change the way that the food industry works. And we have to be, you know, better late to a party than never, right? But we're at a point where it's not only the climate impact of the sheer volume of coal that's used in that district, but it's also that it's just not going to be economic for people to produce food if they don't get coal out of their system. And I think that's one of the things that we probably haven't thought about for a very long time, because of that slowly sense, these economic things haven't bitten as hard as they're about to. So I think you may have seen this diagram earlier in the day. I was talking about it with a couple of people at lunch. Interesting to me that agriculture has sort of popped up as, you know, the kind of number one now. And part of that, of course, is because of changes to transportation, changes to the mix of transportation, you know, increases in public transport, increase in EV, decrease of travelling. But also, I believe that you're going to see that transport one is going to come down just under sheer economic forces in the next period of time, and that those financial shocks for agriculture are still a little way away. And I want to talk a little bit about what that might mean. So I've mentioned to you, like, for me, the failure is not seeing the business model changes and not seeing how that economic and regulatory environment that we're operating in, whether that's things like the taxes might be part of it, you know, so are we subsidising public transport for young people? That's all part of the business model. And if we think about those economic levers, and I'm not an economic determinist, But I can just really see that over a sort of 40-year career in tech, it's not the tech that wins, it's when it's affordable. It's when, my first modem was the size of this lectern, cost me $15,000. Had to go to the bank for a loan. They told me there was no future in this thing. And I wish I'd saved the letter. That might explain the terrible IT at my bank. In today's dollars, this was sort of 200 grand. Does that make sense? For me to buy that first modem. And yet what we've seen is that in my phone now, I have so much better computing power and hotspotting power than I could ever have imagined was going to be possible, let alone in such a small thing. And as those economics change, that's what's changed the rest of our access to tech. So some of the things I'm really interested in at the moment is I'm really interested in the future of breast milk. And so you didn't know you're going to get to hear about breast today, but let me tell you, breast is always best. However, in the society and the way that we've set up our cultures around the world, it is increasingly difficult for many women to feed their babies. And if we think about this, when I had my first child, who's now, got children of his own, I got to stay home with him for a couple of years. Somebody, one of the mothers rocked up and did some of our laundry. Somebody encouraged me to put my feet up when I was feeding my baby and made me a cup of tea. And there was quite a lot of spaciousness. I can't imagine what it would be like to be trying to feed a baby pumping while I'm in a back office, going to work. All of the things that, with the way that we live today, makes it so much more difficult. And this demand for breast milk has really risen for infant formula. And New Zealand's economy is quite dependent on infant formula. So what we see is that there are more and more companies around the world that are saying, well, why would we produce cow's milk and then put a whole lot of additives into it, including palm oil, that makes it vaguely like breast milk? Why wouldn't we just make breast milk? And so these companies are making breast milk with precision fermentation. So they take basically sugarcane or another very high carbohydrate crop. Instead of putting that into a cow and then making milk and adding things to it, they put it into a vat with microbes that are designed to make human milk, or to make lactoferrin, which is the iron in human milk, or to make casein or whey. And we've seen this just explode around the world, and the price per kilo has gone from $2 million a kilo 10 years ago to under $7 now. Slowly, suddenly. And these economic changes make a massive difference, to the point where the White House recently said that the biggest issue facing American agricultural workforce is the need for this precision fermentation workforce. And so it's thinking quite differently perhaps about what farming might look like in the future and what food production might look like. And I want to be clear, I've got a bunch of farmer friends in the room. I'm not saying we've got to rush out and plant sugarcane. It's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying here is that the perceptions of some of the products we make, the way that they're being made will change, and they'll change because it's not economic to make the product in the cow. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with farming. I want to be super clear here. And we see these increasing, and we've seen them in our region as well as around the world, the growth of indoor agriculture. And you think about if you farm in an area that's affected by floods or drought or wind or any of these things, being able to do controlled indoor agriculture makes a lot of sense. And I believe we're only just beginning to see that. Now, the first couple of generations of these went broke, and they went broke because they had a terrible business model. And what we see is that the business models that work around vertical farming are either luxury goods like these lot, or they're doing integration with a supermarket. So Walmart is one of the biggest investors in vertical farming now, invested in a company run by a Kiwi, Arama Kukatai, and they are putting these farms into their supermarkets. So they're organic, they're carbon neutral, they're run with LEDs, they've got solar on the roof, and so the price to actually run them is incredibly low, and they're in what was originally warehousing space, so the rent is low, so you've got low rent, low energy costs, controlled environment, organics, and you're cutting to order, and you use the data that you have from your supermarket to be able to tell you exactly what people want to buy. And so you can kind of go, oh, last year they all bought radicchio in August or whatever, and so you can plant that again, and you have a 6-week cycle. And these business models are radically changing the way that we produce, particularly horticultural products. So, we see that coal for food use is big around New Zealand, not so much in our region, which I think gives us quite a lot of benefit. You can see we're one of the few regions that doesn't, we're pretty bland there in the colour. So I think that is a massive opportunity that we haven't realised, coal is kind of under the radar often in New Zealand, but to me it's one of the massive benefits that we have here in the Wellington region, that we're not big coal users, and we're not going to have to really think about how to move people off process heat onto something else. So I think it gives us a real kickstart ahead of pretty much every other region in New Zealand. The other thing actually I wanted to mention in there is you can see up the top these curves. So exponential curves can go up or exponential curves can come down, but the price of production of energy by solar has just been plummeting over the last few years. And last year, the production of energy by solar or wind is now cheaper than the building and maintaining solar or wind is cheaper than maintaining coal plants. Now, when you get to a point where it's cheaper to build and maintain something than just maintain the other, that's again when one of those economic tipping points happens, and then the price continues to be pushed down quite hard. So I'm expecting to see, even though the price of solar and wind is almost at zero, globally, I'm expecting that to come right down, and in some parts of the world we're actually seeing it go negative, which is kind of an interesting one, where you're actually almost having to pay people to produce it because the cost of it is less. So these big changes to the economics make a massive difference. I worked in a building in the UK where the windows produced more electricity than the office block could use. And I think we're starting to see some of these where we've thought about rooftop solar, but increasingly we're going to see PVs built into buildings in ways that we're not currently seeing. And for developers, it makes a massive amount of sense because they can really differentiate that office space from other office space where the building is already producing the electricity that it requires. And so if you're doing things like build to rent, you're getting more of an asset from that business than ever before. And this, particularly New York City, I've been to see a couple of these there, a couple in the UK. It's really changing some of the economics of property development, and it's something that we should be thinking about in our planning. I've just come back from a trip to Copenhagen. I've been there several times and met with not this trip, but the last trip I met with their deputy mayor for climate. They are working incredibly hard on how to be the first carbon neutral capital, and energy has been their focus, and I guess that's part of why I think about energy, because it's an easy one for us to solve. We may have talked about agriculture popping up as our highest. To me, transport is now on its way downwards, whatever we do, but we are going to have to think about how do we produce enough distributed generation of electricity to really decarbonise that fleet. And so they've thought about that a lot. I think it's interesting that they're even thinking about things like, can we capture heat from the sewers? What are some of the things, some of the untapped resources that we might have? And then, if you look around the world, I'm not going to go into all of them, but, Amsterdam, Cleveland, there are a lot of these cities that are leading the way. Some of them live in countries that are doing big things on climate, but many of them are not, and they're just like, Cleveland has just gone ahead and gone, we're going to think deeply about how we plant our trees, where we plant them. Melbourne has got some really big studies that shows that the planting of trees has reduced the temperature in downtown Melbourne by 1.5 degrees, and now they're working on how they double down on that. So there's a heap of urban design that we can also use, which is thinking about not just the carbon piece, but how do we make the place more livable in the face of the changes that we've known for a very long time are coming at us. And so we can see more and more cities too, Madrid, and others starting to build Paris, and even in the kind of what was originally some of the Eastern Bloc. I've spent some time in Croatia and in Poland, where we see this real effort not just to put public transport in, but to cool the city. And, on a day like this, it's hard to imagine that we want to cool the city anymore. But we are going to need to be thinking about that. How do we think about these different ways of putting grass through, grass and planters planting into car parking? So things like the concrete grids that allow plants to grow through them. We need to be thinking about how do our cities absorb water better. And we don't have to make this stuff up. There are already cities around the world and regions around the world who are thinking deeply about how do we design for, do good urban design for cities that are hotter and wetter or hotter and drier or windier, and all the things that we know are coming at us. So I was talking in the break, Atkins Ranch, which I'm on the board of, we've moved, we put our toe in the water around regenerative agriculture up in the Hawke's Bay, and we only farm from Tairāwhiti down to Masterton, so we had a lot of farms that were affected by the floods recently. And so we've been really thinking over the last sort of 5 years, what would it be if we moved to a regenerative agriculture? What would that do? And for us, again, the economics have been one of the best things we've ever done. We get really high prices now for our skins. We're getting good prices for our meat. We're getting good prices for all parts of the animal. And we used to kind of walk around trying to evangelise and tell people about it. And what we've really learnt now is kind of over here doing it makes a much bigger difference to people than pointing at them and telling them that they're wrong or that they should do something differently. So I really would encourage you to think that if you build a model that works, people start going, hang on a minute, how are you making more money than us? Or hang on a minute, how is your city surviving much better than us? Or how is your city not needing to have to put in more and more flood infrastructure? And so really thinking you don't have to bring everybody else out there. We can bring all of us in the room along to try some experiments. If they work, let's double down on them through the region. And you don't have to waste your time trying to convince the people that don't need convincing. And so I've talked about the high fuel prices changing habits. I just want to touch on a couple of things because I do live in this agriculture space, and we've been debating he waka kanoa for quite a long time. I know that not necessarily the people in this room, but I know a lot of farmers who feel very happy that we've managed to kick kind of farming and the ETS down the road for a bit more. My real concern is that if we don't deal with our agricultural emissions, somebody else will. And so the EU has passed legislation that will enable them to put tariffs on carbon-intensive industries. Agriculture is not currently on that list, but one of the worst things that could happen to our farming sector is that our customers determine the tariffs rather than us. And so if we don't put tariffs on, we can see that globally we will be punished. And what we can also see is that many of our customers are saying that offsetting is just not acceptable. That offsetting is not, we have to reduce emissions at source. And so again, if we want farming and agriculture to thrive in our region, we have to help farming and agriculture and food production in our region to reduce their gross emissions, not their net emissions. And I think that's an important thing, and it was lovely listening to your solutions this morning. But I feel like we've moved on from that kind of idea of net emissions. We need to be really focusing on the gross our customers are, and the regions that we're exporting into are as well. And so finally, I go to the US most years, and I go and I see who gets the highest price for milk and what do they get for it. I do the same for a bunch of other products, fruit, vegetables, meat, but milk is really interesting to me. So up the top, this is 28 fluid ounces, which I've now forgotten what that is. Does anyone remember? What is that? I don't know. I did know the calculation. Anyway, that's like $6.09 in the supermarket. What it's got is what I call stacked benefits. So it's got chocolate in it, which makes it much more delicious. It's also A2 milk, and it's also regeneratively farmed. And if you tried to pull one of those attributes out, you may not get a higher price. But what we've found by talking to customers is that you need to stack up multiple attributes. So carbon neutral plus A2 plus chocolate will get a higher price than carbon neutral alone. Does that make sense? And so here what we see too is the most expensive milk I could find was this ahimsa milk. For those of you who know, ahimsa means cruelty-free, and it means milk where the calves have been allowed to live. Sorry, I'm just going to cough. Some of these farms only have, a dozen dairy cows. And then what we see is more and more of these carbon neutral milks, and every time I go back to the States, I see more of them on the shelf. So I believe that we've got a real place for what I call artisan production. So what I mean by that is smaller scale, high quality, farming with the earth, farming with the farmer. So we're thinking about the welfare of the people who are farming, we're thinking about the welfare of the planet, and we're thinking about the welfare of the animals. And if we want to compete against that precision fermentation, real milk will not be enough. It's going to have multiple attributes. So it's going to have to be real milk that's farmed in a very specific way. And I'm saying this because I want us to continue to have agriculture in our region, whether it's milk or whether it's meat production or whatever. But we need to think deeply about this markets and what the market is telling us. So the last thing I just want to leave you with is a bit of a provocation about a few questions. And so this real one about, what does free energy mean? And how might we think about if the cost of energy is continuing to decommodify, and yet other costs of energy, like the cost of coal or the cost of petroleum, are only going to increase. What does this mix mean for us? And at some point, there's a point where it just becomes completely uneconomic to do the old system. So how do we allow people to make that transition with as little pain as possible? How do we enable people? If you look at the EU, they've set the final dates that internal combustion engine cars can be sold. How do we help people to make the transition? And that regulatory environment in the EU was an answer to that question, was that they said that what innovation needed was certainty. And if we gave people certainty, they would be able to make the right economic choices for them. But the longer we delay, actually the harder the transition that we make for people. So, kia ora mai tātou, no reira mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Imagination is more important than knowledge is the quote on that last slide, and it reminded me of what Nate said to us this morning about harnessing the oceans of our thoughts.